The Peace Garden State is home to some remnants from the collapsed towers. Several segments of the beams from the towers are on display at the International Peace Garden, along with a series of signages explaining the events of the day. The garden straddles the border of the U.S. and Canada. CEO Tim Chapman says it's a solemn day, but an important one to remember those we lost.
The Canadians making a gesture to Americans in a tough time, and that's what the garden's all about, is that cooperation between the two countries, even in tough times like what everyone experienced around 9/11.
The pieces were donated by Rotary International, North American firefighters, and the Manitoba government in 2010. Each year, school groups and the community come together to share memories and give tribute to those who have fallen.